Everyone. Recently, Donald Trump won the U.S. presidential election. The second Trump administration will begin in January 2025. When we think of U.S. presidents, many historical figures come to mind, such as the first president, George Washington, or Abraham Lincoln, known as the father of emancipation. However, did you know that among the past presidents of the United States, there was one who was quite eccentric? That would be Andrew Jackson, the seventh president of the United States. He had a few nicknames, one of which was Sharp Knife. This nickname came from the fact that he orchestrated the mass slaughter of Native Americans. Another nickname he earned was King Mob. Mob refers to a crowd, rabble, or violent group. In other words, this nickname means something like the king of the foolish masses. What kind of person was Andrew Jackson, a president who earned such nicknames? Our journey through history today takes us to America a few decades after its founding, as it was maturing as a nation. Let us explore the story of Andrew Jackson, a man who came to be known as the most insane president in American history. Andrew Jackson assumed the presidency in 1829. Just 1 year later, he caused one of the great tragedies in American history. At that time, several decades had passed since the founding of the United States. The United States was based primarily in the eastern part of the continent, where many Native Americans, original inhabitants of the land, still lived. Amid this situation, President Jackson enacted the Indian Removal Act. This law allowed the government to seize land inhabited by Native Americans and forcibly relocate them to the western part of the continent. Of course, the Native Americans were unwilling to accept such a law. It is only natural they would never willingly agree to have their ancestral lands, where they had lived for generations, taken away by strangers who came from across the ocean. However, it is believed that many Native American leaders were pressured in some way and forced to agree to this law. As a result, tens of thousands of Native Americans were forcibly relocated to the western part of the continent, in what is now the state of Oklahoma. The journey spanned 807 miles, and which took several weeks, claimed the lives of 15,000 people due to cold and starvation. Among the Native Americans, there were tribes that sought to coexist with white settlers, adopting European customs and ways of life. However, such efforts were disregarded, and more than 70,000 Native Americans were completely deprived of their homelands, forcibly relocated to distant western territories, where they suffered and lost their lives. Many lawmakers opposed the Indian Removal Act, and there were even Supreme Court rulings that prohibited the forced seizure of land. Yet, Jackson refused to halt the forced relocation of Native Americans. Why was Jackson so fixated on the removal of Native Americans? It appears that he was an unwavering racist. In a speech Jackson gave in 1833, he made the following statements: "It is impossible for Indian tribes to live alongside us, white people, and coexist. Indians lack intelligence, diligence, and even basic human habits. Despite being surrounded by superior white people like us, they fail to realize their inferiority, and therefore, they are destined to vanish." With such a man as president, the fate of Native Americans on the continent became unbearably harsh. You may wonder why such a merciless and cruel person could become president. To answer this question, we looked into Jackson's actions and statements before he became president. It turns out that his roots lay in his success as a military man. Before becoming president, Jackson had risen through the ranks by distinguishing himself in numerous wars, solidifying his status and reputation. Between 1812 and 1815, the United States fought the British in the War of 1812. At the time, the British forces included Native Americans, who had allied with them. In 1814, Jackson achieved victory in a battle against the Creek Nation, a Native American tribe. During this conflict, he indiscriminately killed Creek women and children and seized their vast territory, amounting to approximately 22,980,000 acres. Furthermore, during the Seminole War in 1818, Jackson invaded Florida, which was then under Spanish control. In Florida, he massacred Native Americans, as well as escaped African American slaves who had sought refuge there. The American forces under Jackson's command showed no mercy to women or children, capturing them and destroying Native American villages. They even employed military dogs to burn and raze the settlements to the ground. It was through such ruthless tactics that Jackson earned one of the nicknames introduced earlier, Sharp Knife. As you can see, Jackson's dislike for Native Americans was deeply ingrained, almost to an extreme. Additionally, Jackson's behavior during these wars was highly authoritarian. During the Battle of New Orleans, where Jackson's American forces achieved a decisive victory over the British, he declared martial law, placing the entire city under military control. What's more, Jackson refused to lift the martial law even after the victory, despite the fact that such measures are typically reserved for emergencies. In this way, Jackson was already acting like a dictator during his time as a military leader. However, his ability to lead numerous battles to victory earned him significant popularity among the public, eventually propelling him to the presidency. His presidential election was far from peaceful or smooth. The election to choose the seventh president took place in 1828. During the campaign, Jackson promised political positions to several of his supporters. In essence, he told them, "If I become president, I'll give you this position, so vote for me." He ultimately won the election, but the night of his inauguration at the White House turned into utter chaos. Crowds of people, seeking positions from Jackson, or simply wanting to catch a glimpse of the new president, flooded the White House. As a result, thousands of his supporters drank heavily, broke furniture and dishes, and spilled food onto the carpets. A woman who witnessed the scene recorded it as follows: "Not only boys and black people, but also women and children were running wild, crowding together, and fighting. It was a pitiful and undignified sight." From the events of that day came the nickname, King Mob, meaning, the king of the foolish masses, which I mentioned earlier. On the other hand, it seems Jackson wasn't exactly a liar, as the people he promised political positions to during the election actually received those positions. Upon assuming the presidency, Jackson immediately dismissed 919 government officials, equivalent to 10% of all government employees, as well as 423 postmasters, replacing them with his own supporters. However, this personnel shakeup was reportedly intended to address corruption and misconduct that existed within the government at the time. Back then, the monopolization of key government posts by a small elite class was a significant issue. Nevertheless, having surrounded himself with his favorite supporters and friends, Jackson became even more arrogant. For instance, when he clashed with his first vice president, John Calhoun, Jackson reportedly said, "John Calhoun, if you intend to secede from my country, I will separate your head from your body." In other words, he threatened to behead him. Such an extreme statement is quite shocking for the leader of a nation to make. Jackson also had a tendency to change his stance to suit his own convenience. For instance, when the Supreme Court's opinion aligned with his, he would say, "The Supreme Court is the highest authority in the country, and we must obey it." However, when the court's opinion differed from his, he would completely disregard it. One such instance occurred in 1832 when gold was discovered in Georgia. The Supreme Court ruled that the Georgia law that confiscated Native American land where gold was discovered violates federal treaties. In other words, the Supreme Court declared that the gold discovered in Georgia belonged to the Native Americans and could not be taken from them. However, Jackson ignored this ruling. He seized the land and gold from the Native Americans and forcibly relocated them westward. where Jackson did and said whatever he pleased. Jackson's racial prejudice was not only directed at Native Americans, but also at black slaves. He assumed the presidency in 1829, more than 30 years before the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in the United States. At that time, abolitionists in the North, where slavery had already been banned, were raising their voices against the continuation of slavery in the South. Abolitionists began sending written appeals to Southern residents who operated plantations with black slaves, direct mail. In response, Jackson banned the distribution of such materials and made the following statement: "It is a crime to stir up the fear of a war over slavery in the South. I am deeply saddened and regretful that such men live in this blessed country." He concluded with this: "Abolitionists deserve to pay for this wicked scheme with their lives." In other words, Jackson was effectively saying that abolitionists should die. However, Jackson outwardly maintained the stance that slaves should be treated more humanely. Yet, this was merely a facade. In reality, it is said that slavery was the source of Jackson's wealth. At his peak, Jackson owned more than 150 slaves, and he also profited from the buying and selling of slaves within the United States. Clearly, Jackson was firmly on the side of those who continued to exploit slavery. There is also this account. When one of Jackson's slaves escaped, Jackson offered a $50 reward to anyone who captured the runaway. Furthermore, he promised additional rewards for whipping the captured slave. He offered $10 for every 100 lashes, up to a maximum of $300. To Jackson, it seems that Native Americans and black people may not have been regarded as human beings at all. Jackson's final act as president was driving the United States into an economic panic. One of his famous statements was, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill the bank." It seems Jackson was furious about the corruption within the banks at the time. As he declared, Jackson drove the federally chartered Bank of the United States into bankruptcy and transferred its funds to state banks that were favorable to him. However, this action ultimately led to inflation and caused chaos in the domestic economy. Furthermore, in 1836, Jackson issued an order requiring that land purchases be made with gold or silver instead of paper currency. This made land more difficult to sell, worsening the economic situation even further. Amid this turmoil, Andrew Jackson, often referred to as the most insane president in American history, stepped down at the age of 69, concluding his tenure as the 7th President of the United States. Despite being such a controversial president, Jackson left behind an episode that reveals an unexpected side of him. This story takes place in 1806, long before Jackson became president, when he was 39 years old and engaged in a life-or-death duel. His opponent was a lawyer named Charles Dickinson. Dickinson called Jackson a coward and a mere braggart, and insulted Jackson's wife by calling her a bigamist. Incidentally, Jackson's wife had indeed remarried Jackson before her divorce from her first husband was finalized. However, by 1806, the situation had already been resolved, and her bigamy was no longer an issue. Nevertheless, Jackson could not forgive the insult and challenged Dickinson to a duel. When the duel began, Dickinson fired first. He was known to be an excellent marksman, and the bullet from his pistol struck Jackson in the chest. However, the bullet hit a button on Jackson's coat, deflecting its path so that it didn't reach his heart. Jackson's return shot hit Dickinson in the chest, and Dickinson bled profusely, dying a few hours later. On the other hand, Jackson, despite being shot in the chest, survived with what seemed like incredible luck. The bullet lodged in his chest could not be removed, even through surgery, and remained there for the rest of his life. Jackson was known to say, "I can forgive someone for insulting me, but I will never forgive anyone who attacks my wife." Jackson's wife passed away the month after his presidential election. After her death, Jackson reportedly carried her portrait with him at all times. In this way, Jackson was not only an extraordinarily lucky man, but also quite the devoted husband. Even a president who often appeared arrogant and domineering had a capacity for love. However, it is also true that he harbored something akin to hatred in his racial prejudice against Native Americans and black people, leaving behind a cruel and tragic legacy. The complexity of the human heart and the scale of the tragedies it can create leave one with nothing but a deep sigh. The history of the world is still shrouded in mystery. Let us continue our journey together to uncover the mysteries of the world. Until our next adventure, see you again. Thank you for watching.